Okay, I believe it's recording. Okay, awesome. So I wanted to ask you first, a little bit about your background working with individuals that were in sex trafficking. You
Okay.
can say a little bit.
Okay. So I worked for the juvenile jail for over 2 years in Granbury, and they have a program that works with the domestic minor sex trafficking girls here in Texas. And so I worked with them for about a year and a half because I didn't actually start with them when I first started. So about a year and a half of working with the girls from in the jail system. So they were there typically for drug use or stealing or whatever got them caught. And then that's how they found out they were being trafficked.
Okay. Let's see. And then some of the questions that my class wanted answered is about the most trafficked areas or the cities in the US.
Okay. So I know here, I believe like the most trafficked areas are El Paso. Um, and like the bigger cities are pretty common. It's actually pretty common Fort Worth too. It's not like the biggest, but pretty sure if I'm not mistaken that El Paso is the most common trafficked place in Texas.
Mhm.
I know that they're like ranked pretty like high. I think almost like 1,000 cases were, if I'm not mistaken, I think in 2020 there was almost 1,000 cases of human trafficking just in Texas alone. So
Okay. And why is that? Why El Paso?
on the border. And you
Oh,
have like the cartels are big into sex trafficking.
mhm.
So especially the domestic sex trafficking where they get the girls hooked on drugs and then they send them home every night.
Okay.
So, and there's a bigger reason for them not to say anything because the cartels are involved and they are terrified that their parents will be killed like they tell them they will be. So,
Hmm. Okay. And do you have any like statistics or do you know like how often this like happens in the US?
um, not positive on how often it happens in the US, but I know like it happens every day. I
Mhm.
just don't know the exact numbers for that.
Okay.
So, it's a daily thing and it's higher than it should be. Well, any number is higher than it should be. I'm like,
Mhm.
even if it's just one, but it is pretty outstanding. I know that like just that 1 year alone in 2020, if I remember correctly, from like when I was doing studies a while back, I want to say it was at least almost 1,000. It may have not been quite 1,000, but I think it was almost 1,000. That was just in that whole year of 2020 alone.
Oh wow.
So, um, and that was during COVID and all the stuff. So
Mhm.
I'm not sure if that would have been higher if people were actually going to school and stuff. Because most of the teens that get trafficked are trafficked through school.
Mhm.
So,
And then oftentimes, we think that these kids are getting like kidnapped, but
mhm.
what is like the most common recruitment method?
um, the high school system getting young boys involved in it so that they pick a girl that seems shy and doesn't have any friends,
Mhm.
and they they groom them. They groom them. Some girls take longer to groom than others, but they give them things. They dote on them. They make them feel special, and they don't really have a lot of friends. They don't get to talk to people about like what's happening, which makes it easier for the trafficking too. Because
Mhm.
if they're not talking about like what this person's doing, then no one's going to be aware of like, hey, maybe this is not a good thing. So that's the typical way that they get trafficked. Sometimes they're already on drugs, and so they can get them trafficked pretty easy that way. But typically it's setting up somebody in the school systems to prey on the ones that are a little bit more socially isolated.
Okay. So through relationships and grooming.
Mhm.
Okay.
And a lot of these girls think that like that's their boyfriend and they were helping them out and all the things. So it makes it really complicated when you're trying to help them like get out of that mindset. They're like, well, I was doing that for my boyfriend and I want to go back because I was making a lot of money and this and that. I'm like, you don't understand. You were actually being trafficked.
Mm-hmm.
but in their mind, that was their boyfriend, and they were helping them because they did all this special things for them at first, and they had a special relationship with this person.
Mhm. Did you meet any individuals that found their like mates online?
Some, yes, but most of them it was through school. So
Okay. Um, okay, so when working with the survivor or the families, what would be like the best form of treatment types?
so that gets a little bit more complicated. EMDR is really good for like trauma in general. Um, DBT is one of the best, like getting them to change their like how they think of the issue, which is similar to EMDR, but EMDR is way a whole different scale.
Mhm.
And the trauma focused, doing more of the trauma focused. CBT, if you're going to use CBT, would be an option. That's what we use with our children that have been through sexual abuse as well. So any of those combinations, depending on the client, would be a good option. DBT is really good with those dealing with that kind of trauma too. So
Okay. And how do you help the survivors feel safe again?
that's hard. That's super hard. They felt safe because they were in jail. So I have a very limited experience working with the ones outside of jail. So I know you might have got a little bit of information from Brandy on that one because she works with them who are no longer in their like may have never went to jail or no longer in jail or whatever. So she has a little bit more experience working with the ones that are out and about and living the world. Mine felt safe because they were in jail for a guaranteed of 9 months.
Mm,
So, which sounds insane that they were happy about being in jail, but that gave them a safe space. They didn't have to worry about their parents getting hurt because they said something. All these different factors played a
mm,
role in them feeling safe. Getting them to feel safe when it was time to go home was a little bit challenging because they'd been there for so long too. The minimum program was 9 months, but most of my girls did not get out until after a year, just because they didn't work the program properly. Because you have to at that jail system, they required like all these different steps, and you had to make improvement in these different areas. Um, and if they weren't working the system or like actively like working through their issues in therapy and are doing well in school, they weren't able to move up a level. And you had to have there was 3 different levels, and if you didn't make the third level fast enough or whatever, you'd have to stay longer, or you could have lost a level because you got in a fight or something.
mm,
So, which my kiddos did sometimes because they didn't want to go home.
mm,
So, um, it was a little bit easier for the ones that weren't involved with the cartels to get them to feel safe to go home. It was the ones that were involved in the cartels that were terrified to go home because
mm,
they had gotten the ball rolling on somebody that was a part of the cartels to be put in jail because they were able to give names and stuff, and they were
mm,
um, a part of that. So I guess the biggest part that I helped them with was that the people that they were putting in jail weren't big people.
mhm,
They were like the little people. So the actual cartels did not care about them getting caught, if that made any sense. So
mhm,
that was really the only relief that I could give them, except for like, just be cautious and talk to people that
mhm,
and don't talk, make sure that your family always knows where you are. Kind of thought process, getting them to feel a little bit safer going home. So,
mhm,
but it was a little bit more challenging with those girls than it was with the other ones because they're just like they were more scared of like developing relationships and not necessarily scared of being out in the world. Because especially like boyfriends, because if they were one of the ones that got stuck in that cycle, then they were like, well, I can't trust like any guy has my interest in, best interest in heart
mhm,
or whatever. So that was challenging that thought process. I mean, like there are good people out there. This is how you, navigate that. So
mhm. Okay. Um, what are some signs? So the girls that you worked with or the individuals, they would go to jail for stealing
mhm.
and, other things. So how do you find out that they were trafficked?
because most of them don't tell you. There's a lot of different signs. So some of them are tattooed a specific way. There's specific markings. Demeanor, we always do whenever any kid goes to jail, they do a very thorough background to find out if they've been trafficked by them, and specific questions they ask when they do like the interviewing at the police department. So it's more of like a forensic type of interview that they do that gets that stuff out and kind of has more suspicion. And then some of them are just put in there because we suspected that they were, because we kept all those girls separate from the rest of them because the other girls were just mean to them and they called them prostitutes and stuff. So, I mean, you have teenagers in jail that are just mean. So we kept them separate from the other girls. We had at the jail, there's cottages. That's what we called them. They're cottages and they have like big shared living space, and then they have their individual rooms. And each cottage kind of represented a certain type of like issue that they were coming for. Anger, like we had our anger little cottage and we had our DMST cottage. And so they were kept a little bit separate. So sometimes we would just put a girl in there because we had high suspicions that she was, but she hadn't confessed or said that, yes, this is true. But in therapy, we talk about it like, okay, tell me a little bit what was happening in this world. And then we'd eventually, like once they started trusting the therapist, they'd eventually tell everything that happened. So, and so I don't think that any girl that we've ever put in there that we suspected, wasn't actually trafficked. So, there's a lot of different tales. It's been a really long time, so I can't remember all of them off the top of my head. It used to be pretty easy to see. I don't know that I would recognize it super easily now because it's been years since I've been. I mean, it's been over 7 years since I've done that. So I'm a little rusty. But tattoos and demeanor and a little bit other things on like how they talk about like how they got into drugs and stuff like that will also help you navigate if they were trafficked.
Okay.
So
what are some current changes or advancements to help with decreasing sex trafficking statistics?
so they have a lot of like traffic information. I know that a lot of schools are implementing like things to be aware of. I keep saying it's I know I told you before, I think it's traffic 911, but I don't know if that's what it's called. But there is several in Fort Worth, and there's several branches that are like trying to make it a little bit easier. So if they come into the hospital, because that's typically our first resource that we can get. So they come into the doctor's office for any reason. Like that is our first resource where those doctors and nurses can do a thorough kind of like evaluation to be like, okay, I think this person's being trafficked. So, and also depending on like if this kid's coming in with like a lot of sexually transmitted diseases, because that's where they're going to see them first. So like, how did this kid get diseases? I mean, yes, they could be sexually active on their own, but the likelihood of a 13-year-old being sexually active on her own, having that many types of diseases would probably not be typical. So, and then they do a little bit more investigation. So they flag them and the cops start investigating.
Okay.
So there's a lot more education at the front lines now than there ever was, which I think is great because I mean, they do normally come in because they have an injury or something, or they have an STD or whatever that keeps them like that flags it for, okay, we need to do a little bit more investigating into this child. So they do it for adults too. So
okay. What should be the key areas of concentration when first assessing the current risk level of a survivor?
key area of concentration is their mental state. So just making sure that they're mentally okay, just like you would with any other regular client, making sure there's no SI, or if that, that we have skills to navigate SI, and like that self-hate that they can develop for it. So those are, I would say, would be the keys, things to focus on. when you first work with somebody, make sure they're in a good headspace. So
Do you know any like local resources that we should have for survivors? Any support groups or local organizations?
there is actually quite a bit of support groups around here. I know there's 3 just in the DFW area alone. So it is traffic 911, which is sex trafficking. Okay, that's what I was thinking. So traffic 911 is a one for Texas. They have local branches here too. They have great resources. And then I know that there's one, I can't remember what the one, we just had a they just had a gala for it the other day. I can't remember. I think it was Fort Worth sex traffic victims group that they have. Can't remember the name of it. Sorry, I'm trying to. I know Texas has one by itself, but I think it's called the Net. Net Fort Worth is a sex trafficking exploiting nonprofit in Fort Worth company that you can get information from as well. So they have the Tarrant County has what's called the 5 stones, and that's human trafficking. I know that there, and she may actually talk to you. There's a the lady that runs Grace Counseling Center in Fort Worth. Her daughter was trafficked.
Oh.
And she was trafficked through the online. And she tells her story. So and it's a pretty amazing story that she tells. She was, I don't know if she was 17 or 18 at the time, but she went to meet this guy and then got trafficked. And they went to California, and the whole team of people actually were able to rescue her. So, and she talks about her story and how she got trapped into that lifestyle and all the things, which is pretty awesome. I've heard her story a couple of times, but I can, if you're interested, I can remember. I know the lady that I don't remember her mom's name. I can't remember her name. But we can get you. She does a lot of the work with traffic 911 and other things to help them as well. She's one of their people that set up like how you help people and how you can like how easy it is to get trafficked online. So she set up some things to kind of help implement so that doesn't happen as often. So
Okay, so one more question. So what information do you think is beneficial to, us students or therapists that many professionals don't often think of?
Okay, can you repeat that?
Yes. What information do you think is beneficial to us that many professionals don't often think of?
I'm like just how to get them out of that like victim mentality, I guess. Like because a lot of people don't, they just want to make sure that they're safe, but they don't think about like how to get them out of that victim mentality, how to get them where they can be fully functioning adults, where they're not constantly being afraid of being trafficked in that kind of nature. And how they don't repeat the cycle, because it's very common to repeat the cycle, which Brandy may have told you as well, like how easily they go back into that world because and if they're adults, they go back in the world because they want the money. The kids, some of them get paid. So like their boyfriend gives them a small amount of money. And so they get excited about that. But they're still being trafficked and they're still minors. So it depends on where their mindset is, but trying to get them out of that mindset where they're not victims, and then so they don't go back or feel like because a lot of times we repeat things even if we don't want to. So like some of them don't want to, but we put ourselves back in the same positions either because they got back onto drugs or whatever. So it's really trying to make sure that they have tons and tons of coping skills and that they're in a good headspace, like as far as like not maintaining that victim mentality,
Mhm.
like having that mentality, which most of our girls left with the mentality like something bad happened to me, but that's not who I am. There was one or two girls that are like, I'm going back. I'm like, okay, like there's nothing we could do about like whatever. I mean, we can make note of it. We can tell their probation officer and all that kind of stuff. And they're actively talking about going back into that world. And if their probation officer still wants to send them home, that's what's happening.
Mhm.
So, um, but yeah, so the best thing that we could do and have knowledge is that we have knowledge on that, how to get them out of that headspace and really reshape their future instead of their life always being dominated by this.
Okay. I thought of one more question just
Okay.
whenever you're saying that. Like as a therapist, whenever we have someone that we suspect has been trafficked, what's like the first thing we should do?
So I would contact one of the like because that is one of the things that we can't keep confidential, right? Like if we suspect that we can open up a CPS case and say what we're suspecting. And we're not unsure of who because it's just a CPS case that's we're not going to have like it's not going to be, family member or a friend. It's going to be we're unsure because they're not giving us names or whatever unless they gave you a name. Um I had to do that with one of my girls because she was one of the girls that was in the suspected trafficked area, but we weren't sure. She's never outcried. And so I had to open up a CPS case for them to do more thorough investigation on the guys that were trafficking her. So it was
Mhm.
her boyfriend that was doing it. And so they I had his name and then they had to just but he was the one setting up all the people. So it was just more about I opened a CPS case for that since they're a minor. If they're not a minor, then we would um there is like different branches in the area, like every county and area has their own branch of like reported possible sex trafficking and you can report it anonymously there.
Okay.
So,
All right. I think that's all the questions I have.
okay.
All
Awesome.
right. Thank you.
You're welcome.